everybody. Today we're going to be learning about section 8.5, which is on eutrophication. The learning objective for today is that you can explain the environmental effects of excessive use of fertilizers and detergents on aquatic ecosystems. We're going to cover what eutrophication is, what can lead to it, and the results in an aquatic ecosystem when we are having eutrophication occur. All right, so the general process of eutrophication we have talked about quite a few times in this class, so hopefully this is not new to you, and this is just going to be a bit of a recap. However, one of the things that we haven't really talked about is kind of the difference between man-made eutrophication and then eutrophication that actually just happens naturally in pond ecosystems. So the human-caused eutrophication is what we have typically referred to in this class thus far. Now, a lot of times we just have called it eutrophication, but technically it is called cultural eutrophication or anthropogenic eutrophication. So I just want to use that terminology today so that if you see that coming up on like an FRQ or in a question on the AP exam, you don't freak out. It is the same eutrophication that we've been talking about all year. It just technically is cultural eutrophication is when it's the humans that are causing it. So anthropogenic, remember that means human caused. So when we're talking about this cultural eutrophication, this is just human caused nutrient pollution, specifically with nitrogen and phosphorus. Remember that those are the two that can lead to eutrophication. And you have to remember both of them. A lot of times we talk about nitrogen, but phosphorus is also one too. Now, the reason why these two specifically lead to eutrophication is because they're limiting nutrients in aquatic ecosystems. Usually we don't have tons of them available. And so when we do get extras, it's going to cause a boom in the nutrients. We're all of a sudden going to have extra nutrients, which is going to fuel algae growth. When algae has access to these, it's going to grow uncontrollably. Now, the typical kind of cycle that we have talked about before, which again, I'm recapping here. Now you have these increased nitrogen and phosphorus levels. That's going to cause an algae bloom. When the algae bloom comes in, it's going to cover the surface of the water, which is going to block sunlight. When we get decreased sunlight, all the plants below the surface are going to die because they can't do photosynthesis anymore. When those die, now all of a sudden bacteria is going to be breaking them down. Now bacteria uses oxygen to do decomposition. So as this bacteria is using up oxygen, we are now going to lead to hypoxia, which is a scientific term for low oxygen levels, and we get dead zones. And dead zones are where we don't have this oxygen. Now, we are also going to talk about kind of the major sources of this nitrogen and phosphorus. So the first example is going to be discharge from sewage treatment plants. The human waste, actually like any animal waste, but human waste when we're talking about sewage treatment plants are going to be really high in nitrogen and phosphorus. And so you're going to get these and also phosphates that are used in soaps and detergents. And you can see that in our diagram right here. We might have a water treatment facility. And so they clean out like all the gunk in there, but the nutrients are still going to be left, and that ends up getting dumped into local waterways. Now, another thing is going to be animal waste. Animal waste, like human waste, is going to be high in nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're going to have runoff from those CAFOs that's going to leach into our water, or specifically just run off right into the water. And that is going to be introducing more of those higher nutrients. Now, the other one that we have talked about a few times this year is going to be synthetic fertilizers. So we add fertilizers because they're heavy in nitrogen and phosphorus, which is going to be beneficial to help plants grow. But the problem is you put in so much of it that the plants can't take up everything. And when you get water, you're going to lead into that runoff that is going to then end up in the waterways. So the three major ways are going to be from human waste and the like soaps and detergents that are coming through sewage treatment plants, animal waste, and then also synthetic fertilizers. Now, as I specified, we typically in this class talk about like the human-caused eutrophication, but actually we can get the like natural versions. And so when we are talking about water that has been eutrophied, we're actually going to compare it to natural waterways that are at like a normal level. And these are known as oligotrophic waterways. And oligotrophic waterways are going to be waterways that have lower nutrient levels of the nitrogen and phosphorus. So they're going to have a stable algae population, and they're going to have high amounts of dissolved oxygen. Now, this can either be because they just have a lack of nutrient pollution, so we are not having all of those former sources that I talked about impacting this, or it can also be due to the age of the body of water. Typically, aquatic ecosystems just naturally on their own can undergo succession. As you have sediment build up on the bottom in the benthic zone, this is going to lead to higher nutrient levels. And then over time, these ecosystems are going to naturally shift from oligotrophic to mesotrophic to eutrophic systems. Now, I say water ecosystems, but specifically where we really see this happening is in ponds. And that's why I underlined it there. Usually we're going to have lakes and rivers. They're going to have new sources of water coming in. They're going to have a lot of water movement. And so we don't really get this like standing system where you have the sediment nutrients building up. So especially in like ponds is we're going to see this natural eutrophication just because of the buildup over time. So if we look at this diagram here, up on the very top is where we've got the oligotrophic water. And this is going to be stable algae, high dissolved oxygen, kind of an ideal place for these organisms to be living. Then, as these organisms slowly just die over time and you end up having the nutrients being built up in the sediment, you're then going to sort of have more algae starting to grow because there's higher nutrients. And then eventually you're going to lead to more of a eutrophic ecosystem. And there will be different organisms that are going to survive there. We can have this lead to the dead zones, but a lot of times, like if you've ever walked by a pond and it's kind of pretty greenish and murky, it is probably in a eutrophic natural system there. So typically in apes, we are going to talk about that human-caused eutrophication, but it is important for you to know that technically this can actually happen just in the natural way of life, especially in those pond ecosystems that are going to be more closed off to getting like water cycling through them. So now we're going to talk about the dissolved oxygen and the dead zones. Now, the decrease in dissolved oxygen, which again is called hypoxia, is what actually causes these dead zones. So if we look at this diagram of how the dead zone forms, again, this is kind of the overall process of eutrophication. We're going to have this algae bloom coming in, which blocks it out. You start having dead things dying, which leads to more of the bacteria doing decomposition. The bacteria are going to use up the oxygen in order to do decomposition. And then eventually we're going to deplete that oxygen from the water. Now, remember that all aquatic life requires dissolved oxygen in the water in order to do respiration. Just like those of us up on land, they do cellular respiration to make all of the ATP for their cells, and they need oxygen for that. So those that live in the water, they just get it from the dissolved oxygen that is in the water. Now, the problem is, as this dissolved oxygen decreases, fewer species are going to be able to be supported because there isn't enough oxygen to go around. Now, most fish are going to require at least 3 ppm, which is parts per million, at least 3 parts per million of oxygen in order to survive. Now, the more ideal is going to be like 6 parts per million. That's where they're going to be at a reproductive level where they're thriving enough that they can be reproducing. But they need at least like a 3 parts per million in order to survive. So as this decreases, if we get below those levels, you are not going to have as many of those species that are able to survive. And eventually, none of them will be able to survive. So this is going to be a diagram here where you can look at the Gulf of Mexico. So here's Texas, here's Louisiana in this dark green, and then the grayish is going to be the Gulf of Mexico. And these are going to be levels of dissolved oxygen. Now, all of these reddish areas, they are going to have either 0 or like half a part per million. which is obviously clearly going to be a problem. These are areas where you're getting a lot of runoff. They're very close here to the edge of where this runoff is going to be coming off. Now, areas that are green on this little area are going to be much higher. They're going to be at like 6 to 8. Yellow is going to be kind of in the like 3 to 5 range. Orange is going to be in the 2 to 3 range, but we're seeing clearly some of these dead zones forming where we don't have that dissolved oxygen. And if we're looking here, we're going to see the range of tolerant for fish. So up at like closer to 9 to 10 is where we're going to have the most abundant fish populations. You can support basically all species. We've got a few that have lower zones of tolerance down here, but none of them are going to be surviving under the like 3 or under these like lower ranges. And so the problem is, if we're seeing here in the Gulf of Mexico that you're having a lot of these areas are in that red and orange, it's kind of going to make it very obvious how drastic of a drop-off we see when those levels get too low, which is clearly going to be a problem for the ecosystem, for those who need to fish there. Just all sorts of problems from this dissolved oxygen in the dead zones. And again, this is ultimately due to the eutrophication. So here's going to be your practice FRQ, which granted is the diagram that I just got done kind of explaining. So what I want you to do is to make a claim about which state's fishing industry likely had lower than average profits in the summer of 2011, because this data is from the summer of 2011. And I want you to justify this claim with evidence from the map. So again, remember the gray is Gulf of Mexico, the green is going to be the land. That is going to be your practice FRQ for 8.5, and those are your notes on 8.5 about eutrophication.